This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey there, deep divers. Ready for a deep dive?
Always.
Okay, good. Because
Yeah.
today we're diving into a part of American history that's, it's fascinating, but also a little unsettling, to be honest.
Yeah, for sure.
We're talking Executive Order 9066.
Heavy stuff.
Yeah. And our main source for this deep dive is, it's this really great episode of the Mr. Hutchings History podcast.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
It is. And they just go right into the hard questions, No beating around the bush.
It really gets you thinking about how fragile our civil liberties can be.
Exactly. Especially when a nation feels like it's under threat.
Like, how far can things go, when people start getting scared?
Right. Which is the question we're going to keep coming back to today. But first, let's rewind the clock.
We back.
Back to December 7th, 1941.
Pearl Harbor.
Exactly. You with me.
Oh, yeah, I know where this is going.
Okay, so Pearl Harbor happens.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. is suddenly thrust into World War II.
And the country is just reeling.
Right. There's this wave of fear and anxiety.
And this suspicion, right? Anyone of Japanese descent is suddenly seen as a potential enemy.
Even if they're American citizens.
Yeah, it's crazy how quickly that happens.
It is like suspicion just takes over.
It's like overnight, everything changes.
So this is the backdrop.
With the stage is set.
Yeah, for Executive Order 90666.
February 19th, 1942.
President Roosevelt signs it.
Big moment.
Huge. And this order, on the surface at least, it doesn't actually say Japanese Americans.
Right. It's written more broadly.
So what does it say then?
Basically, it gives the military the power to designate certain areas as, like, military zones.
Okay.
And then they can exclude anyone they consider a threat to national security from those zones.
Okay, but threat, that seems...
Vague.
Yeah, super vague. Like, how do you even define that?
Well, that's exactly the problem.
Oh, boy.
This order was so broad.
Like a blank check almost?
Basically. And it gave the military all this power.
Unchecked power.
Pretty much. And what's even worse is that it bypassed all the normal legal processes.
So no due process.
Whoa.
No judicial oversight.
None. People could be taken from their homes without any real chance to defend themselves.
So it's like you said, the stage is set.
Totally.
We've got this order climate of fear, suspicion, and no legal protections to speak of.
Recipe for disaster.
Yeah. I think we could all see where this is going.
Unfortunately, and it doesn't take long.
So what happens?
Well over 120,000 people of Japanese descent.
Most of them living on the West Coast.
Right. Most of them living on the West Coast are forced to leave their homes and businesses.
Just like that.
Just like that.
And to be clear here, we're talking about American citizens, right?
2/3 of them were American citizens.
They're being punished for their ancestry.
Not for anything they actually did.
It's unbelievable.
It is. And there's this quote that always gets me.
Okay.
Norman Mineta.
Okay, yeah, you know that name.
He was interned as a child and later became a congressman,
Yeah.
He called it a yoke of shame.
Wow.
Powerful words, right?
Yeah, that really captures the feeling of betrayal.
And the humiliation.
I can't even imagine.
It's hard to wrap your head around it.
It is. I was reading in the Mr. Hutchings podcast about, people having to sell their homes and businesses.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes in a matter of days.
For pennies on the dollar.
Everything they'd worked for.
Gone.
It's heartbreaking. And it's like we were saying before, it's a complete violation of their constitutional rights.
Yeah, absolutely. You've got the Fifth Amendment guaranteeing due process of law.
Right. The right to a fair hearing before the government can take away your life, liberty, or property.
Exactly. And then the 14th Amendment guaranteeing equal protection under the law.
And both of those are just completely disregarded.
It's really a low point in American legal history.
So we've got mass displacement, economic ruin, the violation of fundamental rights.
Yeah.
But even in all this darkness, there are flickers of resistance.
There are always those who refuse to be silenced.
Like Fred Korematsu.
Yeah, a 22-year-old Japanese-American living in California.
What did he do?
Well, when the order came down, he refused to evacuate.
He just said no.
He said no. He felt it was wrong, unjust, unconstitutional.
He stood up for what he believed in.
He did, and he paid the price, of course.
What do you mean?
He was arrested,
Oh, wow.
and his case, Korematsu v. the United States,
I've heard of that one.
it became a landmark case.
It went all the way to the Supreme Court, right?
All the way to the top.
So the whole country's watching.
The stakes are incredibly high.
Is the highest court in the land going to uphold the Constitution or side with the government's wartime actions?
Yeah, it was a real test.
So what happened?
So in a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court sided with the government.
No way.
Yeah, they upheld the constitutionality of Executive Order 9066.
So they basically said, yeah, it's okay to violate the Constitution because we're at war.
Well, their argument was that during wartime, military necessity can sometimes outweigh individual rights.
I mean, I get that we were at war, but still.
That's a slippery slope.
It is, and it's kind of terrifying to think about.
No doubt it's been debated for decades.
So what was their reasoning? Like, how did they justify it?
So the majority opinion was written by Justice Hugo Black, and he focused on this idea that the government just couldn't be sure of the loyalty of every Japanese American.
So better safe than sorry.
Basically, yeah, they argued that the internment was necessary to prevent potential sabotage or espionage.
But hold on, didn't we just talk about how not a single Japanese American was ever charged with espionage?
You're exactly right. Not one.
So the whole military necessity argument
Falls apart.
Yeah, seems like it was based on fear more than anything else.
Well, that's what a lot of people argue.
So the Supreme Court just took the government's word for it, even though there wasn't any real proof.
It seems that way, and this is where we get into different historical interpretations.
Okay, like what?
Well, you've got the realist perspective.
Realist.
Yeah, basically they say, look, given what was happening at the time, Pearl Harbor, the fear of invasion, the court's decision makes sense.
Like they were just trying to protect the country.
Exactly. They argue that Roosevelt and the court were making tough decisions in a really difficult situation. Okay, I can kind of see that side of it.
Right, but then you have the revisionist historians.
And they say?
They push back against this whole military necessity thing.
Okay.
They argue that the internment was really driven by racial prejudice and maybe even economic motives.
Like they wanted to get rid of Japanese Americans for other reasons.
That's their argument.
Mm-hmm.
They point out that Italian Americans and German Americans weren't treated this way, even though we were at war with Italy and Germany too.
That's a good point.
And they also bring up the fact that some people actually benefited financially from the internment.
How so?
Well, when Japanese Americans were forced to sell their property and businesses, they often had to sell at a huge loss.
So other people swooped in and got rich.
It definitely happened, and the revisionists see that as part of a bigger pattern.
So it wasn't really about national security at all.
That's what they're saying.
It was just plain old discrimination.
And greed, maybe.
It's just awful to think about. But it makes me wonder, did anyone speak out against this back then? Oh, yeah, for sure. There were dissenting voices even on the Supreme Court.
Really?
Yeah. Justice Frank Murphy, he wrote a dissent that just called it like it was...
What did he say?
He said it was racism, plain and simple.
Wow.
And he pointed out that there wasn't any evidence to back up the claims that Japanese Americans were a threat.
Good for him.
And then there was Justice Robert Jackson.
He wrote a dissent, too.
Yeah, and his was really interesting. He was worried about the precedent this decision would set.
Like it could happen again.
Exactly. He basically said the court was giving the government a loaded weapon that they could use to violate civil liberties anytime they wanted.
And that's exactly what we're worried about, right?
Yeah.
Like this happening again.
Right. And it's even more disturbing when you think about how the government actually hid evidence from the court.
Wait, what?
Yeah, they didn't give the justices all the information.
They were deliberately misleading them.
It sure looks that way. And that brings us to another important perspective.
Okay, which is?
Critical race theory.
I've heard that term a lot lately, but I'm not really sure what it means.
So basically, it looks at how race and racism are woven into our laws, policies, and institutions.
Okay.
So in this case, they'd argue that Executive Order 9066 wasn't just some random event.
It was part of a bigger pattern.
Exactly. They see it as part of a long history of anti-Asian sentiment and discrimination in the U.S.
Like going back to the Chinese Exclusion Act and stuff.
Right. They're saying that this deep-seated prejudice played a major role in how the government and even the Supreme Court reacted to Japanese Americans during the war.
So basically fear and racism were driving the whole thing.
That's the argument.
And then you've got the legal historians.
Yeah, they come at it from a different angle.
What do they focus on?
They're really interested in the Korematsu case and how it changed the balance of power between the government and the courts.
So they'd probably be pretty critical of the Supreme Court's decision.
Oh, yeah. They argue that the court basically failed to protect the Constitution.
By letting the government get away with this.
Right. And they say that set a dangerous precedent for the future.
Yeah, it's scary to think one court case could have that much impact.
It is. And it makes you think about all the people whose lives were just completely upended.
Right, like we've been talking about the legal stuff and the history.
Yeah.
What about the actual human cost of all this?
Right. We can't forget that there were real people behind all this legal and historical stuff.
Over 120,000 people were forced from their homes,
Their communities,
their whole lives.
families were torn apart, businesses lost.
And this whole generation was just scarred by this experience.
Traumatized.
Yeah, traumatized by being unjustly imprisoned by their own government.
And it really hits you when you hear the stories from people who lived through it.
Right, like the Mr. Hutchings podcast has these interviews with former internees,
Oh, yeah.
and their stories are just heartbreaking.
Like that woman who was just a little girl when they had to leave their farm,
Yeah, she remembers being so scared.
not understanding why they had to leave everything behind.
It's just unimaginable.
And the trauma didn't end when the war was over.
No, of course not.
When the camps closed, a lot of Japanese Americans went back home to nothing.
Like their homes were gone, businesses gone.
Everything was different, and they still faced discrimination.
Economic hardship.
The psychological effects.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine how they even began to rebuild their lives.
It's a testament to their strength and resilience.
But they didn't just sit back and take it either.
No, they fought back.
They organized, advocated for their rights.
They demanded recognition and justice.
And in the end, their efforts paid off.
Yeah, like we talked about, Fred Korematsu's conviction was overturned in 1983.
Right, and there was that broader movement to acknowledge what had happened,
Like in 1988 when Congress passed the Civil Liberties Act
which formally apologized for the internment.
and offered reparations to surviving internees.
It's amazing it took over 40 years for the government to apologize.
It's a long time,
But it just shows how important it is to keep fighting for justice.
no matter how long it takes.
And it reminds us that the fight for civil liberties is never really over.
Yeah, the threats might change, the context might be different, but those core principles are still just as important.
One thing that really struck me while I was prepping for this episode was how easily fear can be used to justify taking away people's freedoms.
Oh, yeah.
It makes you think about how crucial it is to be a critical thinker, to question what you're told and to be wary of anyone who tries to use fear for their own gain.
Yeah, like we need to recognize that sometimes losing our freedoms happens slowly.
Little by little.
Yeah, through compromises or justifications that seem small at the time, but
But in the long run, they can have huge consequences.
exactly like that quote by Martin Niemöller.
Oh, yeah. First, they came for the socialist, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist.
Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist.
Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew.
Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me.
Chillin', right?
It's a powerful reminder that we can't afford to be complacent,
We can't just stand by and watch while injustice happens,
even if we think it doesn't affect us directly.
because eventually it will.
It always does.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Executive Order 9066, I want to leave our listeners with this.
Okay.
We've talked about the history, the legal battles, the human cost of this dark chapter in American history.
It's a lot to take in
It is, but it's up to each of us to learn from the past,
and apply those lessons to the present.
to make sure something like this never happens again.
Right. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance.
We can't take our rights for granted,
We have to be ready to defend them.
for ourselves and for everyone.
Well said.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Executive Order 9066.
It's been a heavy one,
It has, but we hope you learned something
and that it got you thinking.
about the importance of justice, equality, and standing up for what's right.
And about remembering the past so we can build a better future.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.